Hello, and welcome to the Stellar Open Protocol discussion. So for those of you watching at home, I just want to give a quick overview. The goal of these meetings is to talk about and plan for changes to upcoming versions of the Stellar Protocol. We go over core advancement proposals, or CAPs for short. These are open source specs that describe new features designed to evolve the protocol to meet ecosystem needs. All CAPs begin with a draft, and they go through a rigorous process before they're actually implemented in Stellar Core. And even then, they don't actually hit the network until validators vote to upgrade to the new version of the protocol that implements them. So crucially, not all drafts make it across the finish line, right? Changes to the protocol, they require deliberation and diligence, and meetings like this, they're just one part in the CAP lifecycle. So today, we have two CAPs to discuss, and again, these are both drafts, CAP 37 and CAP 38, both of which have the same goal, which is to introduce automated market makers, or AMMs for short, at the protocol level. So automated market makers are a simple way to provide liquidity necessary for asset exchange. You may have heard of things like Uniswap. They've shown that automated market makers are effective at providing an easy to access liquidity at scale. They essentially allow for the creation of liquidity pools, which are simple and non-interactive, and which can attract large amounts of capital and enable high volumes of trading. So the goal of both these proposals, CAP 37 and CAP 38, is to add automated market makers to Stellar in order to improve overall liquidity on the network. They differ slightly, but that they have the same goal. So two things before we start. One, this is a technical discussion, very technical. So if you want to follow along, I suggest that you read the CAPs and the recent developer mailing list threads about them, both of which are linked to in the event description. Two, AMMs are a big topic, and the goal today is not to get to the end of the discussion about them, rather we're just beginning the discussion. So we'll start to bring key questions about these proposals to light so that the discussion and debate can continue on the Stellar Developers Google group. We're just getting started. That group is open participation, which means that if you have an opinion or some great insight about AMMs to share, you too can join in. Just follow the link in the event description. All right, without further ado, let us start to talk about AMMs. So again, we have these two proposals, but they have a lot of questions in common, and then they also have some differences, and we're sort of going to get into both today. And the first sort of topic that we wanted to talk about was a question about reserve requirement and how it works in each of these CAPs. So CAP 37 has the pool creator, the person who creates the liquidity pool, pay for the pool ledger entry, and CAP 38 does not increase the reserve requirement. So I guess the first question is, which model is better? Is there any concern about either model? So reserve requirements. Thoughts?
Well, this isn't very deep, but it's easier to reduce reserve requirements than increase them. So, you know, if there's doubt, I guess it'd be more conservative to have the reserve requirement initially.
Maybe we can go over the motivation for not having reserve requirements, because most ledger entries do.
Yeah, I can. Sound is kind of weird. Anyway, so in CAP 38, that version of the proposal does not have the reserve requirement, and the main motivation is basically it's not remotely obvious who should own this thing in the first place. Like, why should any given account be responsible for paying this, which is, you know, it can't be used by a single person in the first place. It's intrinsically a multi-party thing. And being the person who created it isn't necessarily a meaningful concept, but more importantly, it's not that there's no reserve requirement at all, because the pool can't exist if there isn't at least one trust line for the pool. For the pool share, I should say. So basically, it's kind of like you get it like, you know, when you're the first person to create the pool, you get it like half off. You basically get 2 entries for the price of 1. But then, you know, if there were 1,000 people using the pool, it would actually be like 1,000 people paying a reserve for 1 single entry. Or if there were, you know, 10,000 people, it'd be even more like that. So that's kind of the way that I see this motivation.
Okay, so there's no way to abuse this because you can't just create an infinite number of these. You'll need an infinite number of trust lines as well. Okay.
Exactly.
So in other words, basically the trust line, it sort of serves as the reserve requirement rather than creating a new reserve requirement specific to a liquidity pool, right?
That's a pretty good explanation of it. Yeah. I mean, I think like,
I mean, that's a reasonable explanation. Yeah. So it'd be a bummer if we changed our minds, but yeah, and later wanted to like increase it, but that does seem reasonable.
I mean, if that's the case, maybe we're done talking about reserve requirements. Like, does anyone have anything else to say about them? Yeah, we sort of started with the easiest topic just to warm up. So if that one's that easy and we can move on.
I guess like maybe, so the reason I added that question in the first place was because it was more like thinking forward, right? Like there are potentially very large, I mean, a pool basically, to describe it, you need to basically describe, you know, which assets are part of that pool. Right now, we're only discussing constant product as part of this, but you can imagine having a lot more complicated type of pools. So maybe the amount of data that is tied to this one pool could be much larger than what we are talking about now. For example, I think in the compound type of world, they have like multi assets, like more than 2 assets actually in a pool. And I think if you have like in B3 type of stuff, now you have like those bitmaps that are in there as well. I mean, like the cost of that becomes much larger. So I don't know, you know, does that count really just as a single ledger entry, or do we need to do something better? If right now we make it basically implicitly attached to a trust line, we're kind of stuck with that model forever. As opposed to maybe if it was separate, we could imagine, okay, if we change our mind and it has to be more expensive because, you know, those things are gigantic, we can, you know, we have that as a separate thing. But maybe that's fun because yeah, the creator, like we can maybe give the first trust line free or something. I mean, kind of equivalent, right? Like as part of this.
I mean, the thing is, like, there shouldn't be like a gazillion of these things, right? So if it turns out that, you know, I mean, I can imagine going forward that it turns out that there's any number of things. Like it might turn out that we really only want a few hundred of these liquidity pools in the network, and so we would turn it into like an auction to see like which asset pairs are like, you know, worthy of having the automated market maker, or, you know, or it's just kind of, the thing is, even if it costs like 100 lumens to create one of these things, it just wouldn't be that big a deal, because that if it's actually a useful liquidity pool, that cost would be amortized over a large number of users. So I guess it doesn't seem like it really matters. Because I guess we could also say later on, like, hey, price just went up, but we'll grandfather in the existing liquidity pools or something. So
what happens to the pool when the last trust line disappears?
I think in both proposals, it's supposed to be automatically removed.
I'm just wondering if there's some kind of spammy edge case where people create and destroy trust lines quickly to get some kind of ephemeral pool advantage.
I mean, I guess it could, but like the nature of the pool, it's not really useful if it's not sitting around, right? So, and you can't be a participant in the pool if your trust line doesn't exist, because you wouldn't be able to hold the shares. So it's hard to see how you could get value from that. I do think that like Nicola has a good point about the multi-asset pools, you know, like balancer type pools. And I think in that kind of a setting, we could always say, you know, like, okay, well, we're going to charge fees for charge reserves for those types of pools, but not for these types. You know, I think there's a lot of flexibility. You know, we already have a mechanism by which we can do this, which is sponsorship. So we wouldn't have to invent anything new. It's just a matter of like, do we think that that's even necessary at this point? for me, the answer is like probably no.
I mean, like to me, yeah, I agree that right now we don't need it. It's more like is it possible to add it later if we have to? If we're not careful, basically. Because in the Cap 38 world, I guess we would have to force people to wrap their trust line creation with some sort of like sponsorship thing, or maybe we sponsor by default. I don't know. Yeah, maybe that's fine. It just changes the cost of creating a trust line. So maybe that's okay.
I mean, what would the change look like? Like in general, I'm not a fan of complicating today's thing because of potentially tomorrow, but you want to like add like one field to the operation that's like the extra fee for creating the trust line, or the extra reserve for creating the trust line or something.
I think it should just be on type. So I think it wouldn't actually change the contract. So it's actually fine. Yeah. Like if we ever have a new type of pools that are like those gigantic things, and we believe that there should be no free riding on this, then we can always add like this, like those would be sponsored basically, instead of right now they would like right now you have the field that allows them to be sponsored, except we don't use it. All right, I think we can move on.
Okay, so the next question is about DEX integration, which I think is a bigger question. So both proposals give access to liquidity from both pools and the DEX, but they vary in their approach. John, will you just walk us through the difference between CAP 37 and CAP 38 in their approaches to DEX integration?
Sure, thanks. So basically both of them put the access to trading with liquidity pools or automated market makers inside of path payment, and that's the only access point to this functionality. There is no like trade only with the order book or trade only with the AMM. It's just one operation, which is more like trade. Now the difference in how these work is that in CAP 37, Orbit's proposal, like the idea is that you're going to try to always get the best price. So you might imagine a situation where like let's say you have an order and the price is at like $100 or something for whatever you're trying to buy. And like the marginal price on the AMM is at $95 right now. But the AMM has like really, really small reserves. So you might say like, okay, well, first I'm going to trade against the AMM until the price hits $100. Then I'll go and cross the order book and take that first order. And then, now the next price is at 105. And so I'm going to trade against the AMM until it goes to 105, et cetera. And you do both, stepping back and forth between the two, depending on which one gives you the best marginal price. In CAP 38, to kind of avoid that complexity, the approach is basically just, what if I took the entire trade against the AMM, or what if I took the entire trade against the order book, and just give you whichever of those two produces the best price. So you would never do like some AMM and some order book. It would either be all order book, all AMM.
Sorry, best price or best volume? So even if the volume is tiny, you would take it?
So I'm saying best price in the context of like, imagine that I'm trying to trade a specified amount. Like I wanna buy 3,000 widgets or something. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get the best price for those 3,000 widgets. If I can't get 3,000 widgets on one of the two options, then that's not an option.
Wait, sorry. So they're all or nothing now? Oh, I see. Yeah, because it's
that's
a path
how
payment.
payments work now anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
But so in the CAP 37 example, where it always tries to get the best price and may execute part of it via the AMM and part of it via the order book, what does it do? It splits the amount that you want into a bunch of different path payments?
I guess, it's kind of hard to explain what it does at like an implementation level, but it's still going to come through as a single operation. And just inside the implementation, it's going to know to, kind of do this incremental approach. So it's completely invisible to the user.
Right.
And so in both proposals, can you have arbitrage opportunities between the order book and the AMM?
So in the CAP 37 proposal, there are no arbitrage opportunities between the two because they get resolved automatically as you trade. In the CAP 38 proposal, there can be, but the reality is that with like spreads as wide as they are on the order book today, if there were ever a situation where there was an arbitrage opportunity between the AMM and the order book, there would also be an arbitrage opportunity between the AMM and any external order book for the same product. Probably. I mean, like I can't give you an 100% guarantee on that, but I think it's pretty common to have like spreads on the order book today greater than 0.5%. So I would think that if you're looking at any more liquid place in the world, that would probably get you into an arbitrage universe there first.
With the CAP 37 implementation, would it be possible to build an attack where you constantly switch between the order book and the pool, like with a single path payment? Like, is that a concern?
What kind of it, like what would this attack do exactly?
Right. It would take the minimum amount from the pool and then decides that the order book has the next best price. And then after that, it would switch back to the pool. It would just keep going back and forth. While in CAP 38, you would just choose one or the other. Right. Do you see what I'm saying?
So this is, I mean, like there can only, in the world where there's exactly one order book and exactly one AMM, there can only be as many switches as there are offers in the worst case. So like if there's 10,000 offers, there could be 10,000 switches, but there couldn't be 20,000. That would be impossible.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Do I need to convince you of that? I could.
No, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, the worst case behavior is to DEX, not, that's always the answer.
One comment I have is that whatever we implement in core, we have to be able to model it outside of core. Like Horizon has to be able to calculate the same thing to give you the best path payment, and presumably third parties would also want to do that. So we should bear that in mind. Like it can't be completely opaque.
What do people kind of feel about what's the good approach here?
I think one important question here is like CAP 37 seems to suggest that the DEX is a valuable thing and should be maintained, and the markets will be maintained alongside. Because if everything just migrates to automatic market makers, then have this like complexity of interleaving requests, of interleaving offers, seems to be like doesn't make sense, right? So the question is like, do we think that the ecosystem is going to migrate? Like, are there use cases that automatic market makers are not providing a good solution for as much as the DEX is?
I think there are, but it'll probably be per asset pair anyway. Like if I had to predict, I would say that for, if I want to like, do an IPO of my company on Stellar, I'm going to just basically like put the order book there. I mean, it'll be offer my shares for sale, like on the order book or something. Right. And if I'm trying to do like Forex exchanges or whatever, then probably the AMM is going to be best. So it seems unfortunate that kind of like the more intermingling of these abstractions, the harder it's going to be to like, improve each individual one in the future, the more complexity there's going to be. And it's not clear what the payoff is going to be.
The market will do better with impermanent loss, right? So when there's knowledge outside of the blockchain, the market will take advantage of it much more effectively than the AMM.
Yep.
Seems like an argument to have it.
No, I'm not saying get rid of the existing DEX. I'm just saying, have both, but don't have them terribly intermingled. Like the sort of ideally improvements to the MM don't need to like change the logic of the order book as much as possible, and vice versa.
So then it would just be a user choice more than anything, whether to use the AMM or use the DEX.
A market maker choice. The user
A
would
market
just
maker.
get the best price available for a path payment.
Right.
But someone who's trying to make a market could either use our AMM, or if it's not good, then they could use the DEX.
Tomer, I would kind of ask you, like, can you think of anything where people would want to use, like, would have a good justification for using both on the same product? Because I agree with David. Like, I can think of lots of cases where the AMM will be better than the DEX, or lots of cases where, or I say the DEX, I should say the order book. Lots of cases where the order book would be better than the AMMs. But I can't think of a case where people would be obviously indifferent between the two.
Well, I think what could happen is that, that AMMs are used to like bootstrap a market, but that then when the market is like, a really big deal, then some big market maker will come along and they would rather have the control of setting explicit limit orders because they can have a lot of depth and they can kind of adjust to, external factors that affect the price. And so they would prefer that. And so I could see the AMM as a way to bootstrap a market, and then like a full-on market maker using the order book once it makes sense for them to do that, because there's enough volume that is profitable for them to make the market in the traditional way. But Cap 38 would satisfy that without the extra complexity.
So at the moment, it doesn't seem like anyone's arguing that the extra complexity of Cap 37 is worth, has a benefit that makes it worth while, really. Is that true? Is there anyone who thinks Cap 37 and the super interleaved process is substantially better?
But I think the argument for that behavior is actually what Orbit wrote, I think this morning on the dev mailing list, which is trying to limit like the number of times you have like this arbitrage opportunities between AMM and the existing order book. The thing is that I don't know if we have any data really to kind of say that this is going to be a big problem inside, this is like inside a specific pair. Like even on the DEX overall, like you have pairs that, or assets that represent the same thing, right? They're just issued by different people, and that doesn't solve. I mean, Cap 37 doesn't solve that. So that's why I'm kind of in the camp of like starting with this simple thing first, see how that goes, and then adjust like based on that, because yeah, this interleaving so far on the type of things I'm saying, it's actually very hard to even come up with like invariants or things that you want to happen if we want to change the what the MM is doing. Like if it's something more complicated than constant product, I'm not even sure we can explain what we expect to happen. Like we want the best price, but when you have like rounding and all those issues that come in play, it actually becomes really complicated to try to reason about this. So I would delay that decision as much as possible. That's my opinion. But.
And there's a chance that we'll want a third thing that's neither an AMM nor the existing DEX, and so it's nice if the idea that, okay, we can just have multiple approaches to this coexisting and they don't have to be tightly integrated. That leaves us more flexibility in the future.
Great. Anything else about DEX integration, or should we move on to the next topic? Great. The next topic is pool parameter updates. I think Sid was working on something related to this. Is that true?
Yeah, I wrote something on the dev mailing list yesterday. I can talk about that if you like.
Yeah, will you talk us through it?
Yeah, so it's what I propose is an extension on what Orbit proposed, where include the fee in the ledger header. So instead of just having one fee, you have all the fees you may want to use. For example, if you had a couple different constant product pools with different fees, you would have all of them in the ledger header, and depending on which pool you're interacting on, you would pull the fee from there. This would allow you to upgrade the fees without a protocol update. The issue here, though, is that the more pools we add, more parameters we add, if we store this in ledger header, it'll get polluted. Or if we decide to store it somewhere else, it may become an issue. So that was what I proposed. I think Nico had a different proposal related to storing the parameters in the ledger pool key, I believe. And maybe he can talk about that.
Right. So I guess like what I described was not necessarily where to store the. I mean, like there are actually different concepts here. Because let's see. Yeah, there's the other question after.
So just maybe one thing that would help me, can we just talk about what parameters there might be that we would need to store other than the
right? So like the type of things that I think people were talking about. So the obvious one is we have a pool fee, right? That's the one that is kind of really the only parameter in a constant product pool. You have other parameters also, like minimum amounts that you want people to be able to deposit, like basically a unit. You can think of it as a unit of deposit or withdrawal. That helps with guaranteeing certain levels of liquidity, basically, when you do all those operations. What else? I think some of those, when you have like the more than two assets type of pools, those have actually formulas that are getting even more complicated, because now you have like different weights for those assets. I think those are like the ones that are known right now, right? I think for like Uniswap V3 type of pool, you have like a step size also. I mean, yeah, it's up to future. So.
And there are a few other things that are like, for example, Curve has this amplification factor. And that would be something else that would have to be stored if we were to use that.
Is there an issue with storing all of this in the ledger header? I'm assuming like we don't want it to get too big.
Actually,
right?
so the one, actually, I guess like when I wrote this question, what I was thinking at the time was more like there's this question of if you store the parameter as a global, as opposed to be something that is attached to the pool itself. What that means is that if you want to, if you change the value of that parameter, so if you change the fee, for example, you're actually changing the fee for every pool in existence, every instance, right? And actually have a hard time to kind of understand how that model works in a world where you have other parameters other than the fee. Like for the fee, maybe it works. For other parameters, I think it changes the dynamics of the pool so much that you're really talking about a very different pool at that point. And it may not actually be something desirable.
So
because we're establishing a model, right? This first version is we are establishing the model that we want going forward. And constant product is very special. And I don't want to be stuck with that, with whatever choice comes out of that.
So you're really focused here on the update, like updating what should it be possible to update the parameters on an existing pool is kind of the main crux here.
I think it derives from this choice, right? That is, if it's a global, that means when you update it, you change everywhere, right?
my stance on this is that like you shouldn't be able to retroactively update things. You know, if you wanted to switch to a different pool, create the new pool, move your money into there and let people vote with their feet or with their money, however you want to say it. My stance on this is more a UX thing than anything else. You know what I really don't like seeing? Looking on my bank statement and being like, oh, I used to get 1.5% interest. Now I get 1% interest. I didn't agree to that. Nobody told me until after my money had already been sitting there for however long. So I don't think I want to impose that onto other people.
So a pool would have fixed parameters that could never change once it was initiated somehow. Is that what you're saying?
That would be the stance that I would take on this. I think the only exception to this might be like, perhaps we might make the exception that these can change during a protocol upgrade, because generally we take the stance that we can change the rules on protocol upgrades. And, you know, I don't think anybody would be super offended if all the validators plus all the developers plus went through this huge review process to agree like this is going to be better uniformly for everybody. So we should make it the de facto.
But isn't Nico's point that when you make the second pool, if you wanted to change the fee in the second pool, it would affect the fee in the first pool? Are they coupled? Like
in Siddharth's proposal, and I'll let him talk more about it, but he's offering like these three different fee, in his example, he's offering these three different fee tiers. And you could imagine being in the mid-tier fee, you know, you could have the low tier one, the mid tier one, the high tier one, and then, you know, the validators vote like, okay, we're going to move the mid tier one from 0.5 to 0.6 or something like that. So it would still be possible to be in a world where there are multiple pools and still have multiple fees, but have them globally controlled so that existing ones get changed anyway. Not saying that I support that, but I think that's possible. But Siddharth, you can step in here if I'm not hitting this correctly.
No, that was right. And the nice thing here is that you, and I don't know if this actually matters, but you control the number of possible pools, right? I don't know if that matters for like liquidity fragmentation, right? Like if we allow, if we end up allowing like 10 or 15 constant product pools, like will that be an issue, or do we assume that everyone will move to the most optimal pool? Like I'm not sure what will end up happening there.
I tend to think that people would have probably eventually settled down onto the right thing, but I also don't think that that's a particularly nice user experience. It's like decision paralysis when you get to the grocery store and you're like, wow, there's 37 brands of cornflakes. Which one am I going to buy?
Yeah.
Why do you need that in your life?
So it does sound like if we were to make any of the parameters mutable, it would only be the fee, right? Like if like we shouldn't change anything like the curve or anything like that for any of the, you know, if we add a new pool type, like those should not be mutable, right?
I don't think those should be mutable. Only from like, I don't know. Nicolas shared this this very cool defect report that Colton long ago had shared with me, and I shared with Nicolas, and he posted it onto Stellar Dev, which is about changing the curve parameters other than the fee. I say defect report, I guess I should say vulnerability, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, and if you're interested more, you should review that because it's very scary.
I almost feel like this shouldn't be a configurable parameter. And if we do want to introduce a different fee, we might as well just introduce a new type of pool. Like I think that doing like even if you don't change it for existing pools, I'll still, you know, I'll put some money into a pool one day, get, you know, one specific fee, and the next day after the configuration change, it's the same type of pool, but now I'm getting like a different type of fee. So that there's like, it's just not explicit enough.
A couple of people have said, why don't we just introduce a new pool, or why don't we do this? Who is the we in this situation? Does that make sense?
I think there are two different ways one could take this. One way to introduce new types of pools would be as a protocol change. Like if we're going to go from having only constant product pools to having constant product pools and I don't know, something curve-like or balancer with weights or whatever. We'd have to, the Stellar protocol developers, people who work on caps, whatever, would have to make that happen. Another way to look at this is an idea that Nikola had a long time ago about having this this notion of instead of letting people choose any fee they want or any whatever they want, there are some configurations that the validators have voted on are good configurations. When you're creating something, you're basically choosing from that menu of good configurations. And so in that setting, we could be like validators. They voted on saying that now the fee can be both 0.3 and 0.05, So depending on the context, I think we could be either of those.
Cool, thanks. Are there more questions about parameters? I mean, I feel like there's still a little bit more thinking there that we can sort of do in conversation on the Stellar Dev list. I don't want to move on though if there's important things left to be said, but I feel like we're sort of at a good point to move on.
Right, I agree. The next one is actually related and maybe more interesting actually.
You want to explain it? Yeah.
The multiple pool support. Yeah. So it's basically the two proposals are actually quite different there. Like cap 38 actually allows one asset pair to have arbitrary variations of pools for that one pair. So the variation can be on the curve type. It can be on any other parameter, like we just talked about fees. So you can imagine having two pools on the same, two constant product pools, let's say, on the same asset pair, but one is going to be, super low fee, and the other is going to be a high fee, and then, the market kind of gets to decide whatever. Cap 37 identifies pools using the pool type. And then related to the thing we were talking about earlier, the fee is global. So at this point, the only way you can have multiple pools on a given asset pair is if they differ on type. So my question was here is, do we want to have more of the first kind or the second time, right? Like which one is maybe more interesting? Do we want to have those possibly few number of options, right, for a given type, or do we think that one type, one instance of a pool per type is enough?
I think there are some fundamental problems with the notion of one instance of a pool per, wait, hold on, actually, let me make sure I understand you. Do you mean one instance of a pool per pair?
Per pair, yeah, of course, all this is per pair, right?
Yeah,
for a given pair.
So I think there's some fundamental denial of service flaws with one instance of a pool per pair, which is the question of who gets to choose what that pool will be. Is it going to be the high fee one, the low fee one? Is it going to be curve? I think basically if there can be multiple types of pools, we probably have to say that all of them can exist for the same pool to avoid having some arbitrary, and by arbitrary, you can always take that to be adversarial decision maker. Oh, this is a super volatile asset pair where constant product with a high fee would be the best. I'm going to put in, a curve with a super low fee to make it so nobody can use this. Don't want that to happen.
but here, like you have the, using Cap 37 as like maybe as a talking point, like earlier we were talking about fees. Do we think that we want to have more than one fee for constant product for a given pair? I mean, I think that we probably want to have more than one fee, and not just force like people to pick like, oh yeah, this is the right fee for you, because I think that different asset classes actually have different like risk profile and volatility profile, and therefore you want to have a different fee. Like you basically want the like crypto to crypto assets to have probably a different fee than the stable coin to stable coin type of fare, right? So
Yeah,
you can let them compete, and like you were saying, like you can't let a single person decide on which one is the first one. So then, how do you let the market decide? I think that's kind of what I'm getting to, right?
So it would bring market dynamics to bear on these on competing pools. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't really for me, the reality is I don't really see what we're choosing between. Like the choices in my head are kind of like, there is exactly one type of pool and we apply that uniformly across the board, or there's one, maybe you say like, okay, like you can have different curves, but all the ones with the same curve have the same fee, whatever, like whatever you kind of take that model at, you're kind of saying like, I'm going to try to fit all the pegs into a single shaped hole. If you take that approach, and if you don't take that approach, then you're basically saying, well, like I'm going to let the market decide what's the non-stupid thing. And I don't like forcing pegs into holes that they don't fit in. So for me, it seems kind of like a very kind of obvious choice. But I'm wondering if somebody sees the argument that goes in the other direction. Like, is there somebody who's like, no, like John, you're definitely wrong?
Well, I think the argument I heard before on trying to force everybody into the same group is you avoid like splitting the liquidity. But I'm not. That's not my opinion either. So I can't really support it. But I just wanted to call it out. That's actually one of the arguments that people call out here.
I mean, I guess for me, it kind of depends a lot on what the set of options are. Like you can imagine a world where like we just imagine that it was possible to create a constant product market maker with a fee at every 1,000,000%. There's no difference between, I mean, they're not literally identical, but there's no material difference between a fee at 0.3% or 0.301% or 0.299%. They're kind of exactly the same. And I think in that world, you probably do have liquidity fragmentation between people doing effectively the exact same thing differently. Whereas, in a world where you're like, okay, like you have two fees on your constant product. One is like 0.05% and one is 1% for totally different asset classes. I think there's going to be like a very obvious place that people are going to want to put their money in those kinds of cases, and there won't be a lot of blurriness. I'm not 100% sure, but I think the amount of liquidity fragmentation depends on how distinct the options are.
But even in that case, if market dynamics work, wouldn't people be drawn to the pool with the lower fee, right? If they were the same, but one even had a tiny bit lower fee, and then the two pools would be competing. And they would that would push fees lower. Isn't that what you would expect?
Not necessarily. Like, for example, if if prices are moving a lot and so there's a lot of impermanent loss, then people might make more money from the higher fee, even if people traded less as a consequence.
Got it.
And the other factor is if everybody's in the high fee pool, then and like, let's say that like, let's suppose a world where there's 100 equivalent market makers. 99 of them are in the big pool, which has the high fees, and the one other guy is in the small fee pool. In like the cap 38 proposal, for like maybe some small trades would execute against the small fee pool, but all the big trades would execute against the big fee pool because there'd be less slippage there. And so maybe that person would end up making less money by being in the low fee pool, and then they decide to join the high fee pool anyway.
Right.
So I think it's not obvious. There's a bunch of different ways these kinds of things could shape out.
So, I mean, maybe the answer to this is no, but I'm just wondering if there's any, it just seems better to have only one pool, you know, other than the fact that you would have to agree on the parameters. But I'm wondering if there's any way to kind of select a pool objectively, like basically say that, you know, for any given pool, if there's multiple pools for an asset pair, you just pick the one that has the highest product, or highest product plus reserve, where people can pledge some reserve or something, so you can let people sort of bid on what they have. Because what you kind of want is like, you want, like, you know, in the kind of stellar fashion of like, it's just to everyone's advantage to do what everybody else is doing, which is kind of like the whole philosophy of stellar on some level. You kind of would like market forces to decide this. And so to the extent that then a lot of people decide that you want to do something else, then it should like make sense to move over to that something else. But
I mean, that's John briefly mentioned this menu idea earlier. So that's kind of what I proposed earlier. It's basically try to kind of find a good middle ground, right? Like you don't want to have like the single pool, you know, where you're forced into this one rate, you know, across all assets. You know, I think that's kind of trying to that's too prescriptive. On the other hand, if you allow people to set any price, you know, any fee and all that, you end up with like this huge, like you can't pick a pool basically, like there are an infinite number of pools. So the menu idea is to have validators actually describe the combinations that you can use on the network. And the combinations would be for example, like constant product. You can have like low, medium, high fee or something like that. And then when you want to deposit assets in a pool, you pick which item on the menu you want, right? You can say, okay, this is like a stable coin one, so I'm going to pick this curve thing with this parameter, right?
Okay, so here's, you know, this is probably not workable, but just to like get some design point out there. Suppose that, you know, people can sponsor these liquidity pools using lumens, and basically you can propose any value, any parameter you want. However, in order to introduce a new liquidity pool when there's already one for that asset pair, two things have to happen. One, you have to pledge more lumens than the previous reserve as pledged, and two, you have to have like as at least as much liquidity in terms, or the product has to be at least as great in terms of the assets you put in there. So this would allow people to change when everybody wanted to change, but it would sort of make it a little bit sticky.
I get what you're getting at here, but like a kind of just practical implementation type question before we talk about this on the merits is just like, what about the case when you have pools that were like the product is a different number, like the invariant is a different number. You know, the curve invariant is some really complicated thing that's really gross to write down. And it's like not obviously comparable.
There would be some requirement that for any pool that we introduce, there needs to be a depth metric, which is a number, and where somehow we believe that in general, deeper markets are better than shallower ones.
How would you, I guess, like what would, at like a high level, what would an implementation of all of this kind of look like in an abstract sense? But like we need some new kinds of entries and stuff. Like what is it like? How do you say that you're voting for one of these pools? Like, what does it mean for like if you're voting for a pool but the pool doesn't actually work yet? How do all these things kind of work at a high level?
Yeah, I guess you have some number of let's say you have some number of candidate pools, and in order maybe in order to create a candidate pool, you have to pledge sort of twice the base reserve that's pledged for the previous one or something. So we can't get like an infinite number of these. And then for the candidate pools, there's some amount of capital that's pledged. And so if one of the candidate pools suddenly gets more depth, right, there's some amount of capital that's pledged. And if at some point one of the candidate pools ends up with more depth than the existing pool, then people would switch over. So the basic assumption here is that like sort of 90% of the people participating in a liquidity pool would say, hey, like actually we want to go to a lower fee or something, right? And so once everybody wants to do that, they can make it happen. But like, you know, a random person who's just trying to disrupt the existing market would have to like amass a lot of capital and essentially end up making a more liquid market in order to disrupt the existing market.
It's a kind of interesting idea. I'd have to think about that a bit. I like definitely have some concerns along the same line as somebody mentioned. I think Eric mentioned about like this like ephemeral trust line type of thing. You can imagine somebody putting their money where their mouth is in like a huge amount, and then, you know, 5 ledgers later being like, I just did that to screw you guys all up, and then just pulling their money back.
On the other hand, if what they did is provided people like really low fee transactions for 5 ledgers, like, is it so bad? Like, they could have done the same thing by placing offers on the order book, right?
It's a fair point.
So we only have 5 minutes left, and I think that's fine, because I think a lot of these questions we can continue to sort of talk about them, or to think about some of the suggestions that were raised and deal with them on the Stellar Dev mailing list. There were 2 other topics that we didn't really get into. One was compliance, and one was rounding. Do we want to take a second to talk about either of those right now? Would that be useful, or is it too much to take on either one of those topics in the last 4 minutes?
It seems hard and format. I mean, I'm very interested in talking about these, but in detail, it just seems like it'll be unsatisfying to get into them now.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I mean, I think then the question is, what are the next steps after this meeting? I feel like it is to continue the discussion on Stellar Dev, but are there other follow-up actions that need to happen in order to make that possible?
I'm still trying to understand whether we've narrowed down the scope of which pools can exist and which ones can't. Like, for a given asset pair, have we agreed we can only have one pool, or could we have multiple pools with different kinds of curve for that asset pair, for example? Like, I would love to write that down.
Well, I think what we were talking about was that we agree that there would be more than one pool per asset pair. What we are talking about last was more about the governance that goes with introducing a new pool. Like, you can do it in many ways. The good news is that we don't necessarily have to solve that, I think, in this version, because, you know, right now we are introducing only one constant product, and I'm not sure we want to introduce in the first version the support for more than one rate, right? Like, we can basically, for now, like, I think that's what capital E8 says, or even capital E7, there's only one rate. And it's probably fine for the very first version, but it's interesting to think about how to change that in the future, right?
If you'd be willing, David, I'd be like very interested to see like a high-level write-up of what you were describing, so I can think about that more deeply.
Yeah, maybe I can just draft something by email or something.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Doesn't have to be super formal.
Sure.
And I know this is for the future, but there was the idea of a menu, right? That was sort of validate or determined. There was this idea of you can replace by better with some depth metric. Were there any other contenders for ways to do this?
Well, that was the question in the first thing, right? That was don't even allow to have
Yeah.
more than one.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is a third option, sure. Okay, cool.
There's also the free-for-all option, anarchy.
I love anarchy. Every time I'm listening to this, I'm like, we're talking about anarchy, or we're talking about like Soviet-style communism, or we're talking about just like free market capitalism. I feel like there's ideologies behind all these choices. You know, John's like, there should only be one kind of cornflake, right?
I could go for like 3 kinds of cornflakes, just to be fair.
Cool.
Yeah, you want the special occasion. It's your birthday cornflake, right?
Man, I hope you have something like flat blueberry pancakes on your birthday, not cornflakes. I don't even know. Okay, that's time. Thanks everybody, and thanks everyone who's watching at home. Again, this discussion will continue on the Stellar Dev Google group, which you can find a link to in the actual event description. There's already a lot that's happened there, and we will continue to have these discussions in these meetings to start to hammer out more of these proposals. But again, 2 proposals, a lot of discussion, many things that we covered today, but many more things to cover. Look there to see what's happening. This conversation will happen both sort of asynchronously there and synchronously here in the future. And we really appreciate everyone for being here. Thanks, everyone.